You said their headpiece only had markings on one side. You absolutely sure?
Belloc staff is too long.
They're digging in the wrong place.
Robert, tell us, how was the city of Jerusalem different 2,000 years ago than what we see here today?
Well, of course, Chris, the Dome of the Rock would not have been there. And what you're looking at was never the old city of Jerusalem. Those walls represent Fort Antonia, where Titus housed the 10th Legion, which eventually destroyed all of Jerusalem, and the temple itself. Where I'm pointing right here, where that clump of trees are, which today is called the City of Zion, which is on top of a mound called the Ophel, that is actually where the original temple once stood. And just to the south of that, and I mean just meters south, was the city of David, also known as the Citadel. And the entire city of Jerusalem, with the temple, stood in that area right there.
But of course, the Jews believe that the Messiah can't come until the temple is rebuilt. So if it could be shown that the temple never stood where the Dome of the Rock now stands, but stood somewhere else, then that would solve the problem.
It would, Chris, because that temple right there, the Dome of the Rock, is the most contested piece of real estate in the entire world. It could be a trigger for World War III. And if it could be proved, and not only proved, but accepted, that that temple stood on the Ophel, south of Fort Antonia, it could bring about some type of a peace covenant. Haram el-Sharif means noble sanctuary. It's where the Dome of the Rock is located, as well as the Al-Aqsa Mosque. It's the third most holy place in the Islamic religion.
Back before the Dome of the Rock and the Al-Aqsa Mosque were built, back in the time of Jesus and the time of the temples, if the temples weren't standing there, then what was up there in that large area?
Well, that was Fort Antonia, and that's where Titus housed the 10th Legion, which consisted of 6,000 soldiers and approximately 4,000 support staff. Illustration from David Seeloff's website will show you the relationship between the temple and the fort. In fact, there was a causeway connecting the fort to the temple.
Well, Robert, what about the Wailing Wall, or the Western Wall, as it's more correctly known? I mean, the Western Wall is venerated by Jews and millions worldwide. Are you telling me that the Western Wall has nothing to do with the Jewish temple?
That's correct, Chris. It has absolutely nothing to do with the Jewish temple. The Western Wall is the Western Wall of Fort Antonia.
Actually, it's part of the retaining wall, where along the structure this is all established. And these stones of the Wailing Wall are actually used and presumed to be the Western Wall of the temple, but it's not.
The Western Wall today, very interesting, generally part of a Roman fort called Fortress Antonio, named after Mark Antony.
The thing that's important to understand is the place that David bought from Arvana, the Jebusite, was a threshing floor. The rock under the Dome of the Rock in no way resembles a threshing floor. It's a rough-hewn rock full of holes and just very uneven, and no farmer would ever use that as a threshing floor.
So what was this rock? It's interesting. When you look at this rock, what you'll find on the top of the rock is you'll find crosses in it, because it wasn't a rock that was sacred to Judaism, and certainly wasn't a rock that was sacred to Islam, wasn't even involved back then. But it was a rock that the early believers, as early as the 3rd century, we can prove this from the historical records, thought that rock was the rock that was in the Praetorium. So the belief was that that was the rock Yeshua got on top of and gave his defense before Pilate.
What we're really talking about here is the Bible specifically telling us where the temple was built. And Scripture is telling us that the temple was built in the city of David, more specifically in the Jebusite fortress on the threshing floor of Ornan, which is, I would assume, would be very close to the Gihon Springs in some respects.
So Robert, if the Jewish temples never stood where the Dome of the Rock now stands, then where were they built?
Well, they were built several hundred feet south of the Dome of the Rock in an area called the Ophel. And all you have to do is study some verses out of Nehemiah chapter 2 and Nehemiah chapter 3. And again, it pinpoints and gives a very clear description of where the temple was built. The key word in that verse, Nehemiah 2:15, is brook. I went up by the brook. And if you look at Nehemiah 3:7, it uses the word river. There's only one brook, one river, one stream within 5 square miles of Jerusalem. There is no river, no brook, no running water on the Haram el-Sharif. The only place in all of Jerusalem where there is running water is the Gihon Spring.
And where is the Gihon Spring in relation to where we're sitting now?
Well, the Gihon Spring is just a few hundred feet south of where we are presently sitting.
And what is the relevance of the Gihon Spring in relation to where the temple
once stood?
Well, when the ark was in Shiloh and David brought the ark from Shiloh, he placed it at the Gihon spring.
So the Gihon, and it's amazing, a siphon spring, one of only maybe a dozen in the whole world that work that way. In Jerusalem, there's only one water source. One. There's not two, there's not five, there's not three. There's one water source, and not a small source. One major water source, the Gihon, the gusher.
The Gihon spring was very unique in structure. It is literally a siphon spring 400 feet from the bottom of the Gihon up into the temple. And there are 5 historical sources that tell us that it actually happened, that there was a fountain inside the temple.
Well, the Gihon Spring is an ancient water source that's been talked about going way back to the time of Solomon. The springs are still running today. They're not of the force of water that they were, and gave it, the reason that David even took it was probably that water source. But you need to have flowing water in the ceremonial of the cleansing of several things. The priests going in the temple to worship. You need spring water to add to the ashes of the red heifer for purification. So water is essential, and there's no water on the Temple Mount, the traditional Temple Mount up above.
They've uncovered the real pool of Siloam. They just did this in the last couple of years. It's an amazing story how they found it. But what was interesting, I was down there with the archaeologist who actually found it, and he told me that that area was an acre big. And his words, not mine, he said it's the world's largest mikveh. It went off in my head, of course. 10,000 people would be mikvahing there. So the fact, if you're mikvahing and you're getting ceremonially clean down there, does it make any sense that you're going to walk a third of a mile and maybe be unclean again? So the temple would have to be close to the mikveh, where the pool of Siloam is. And yet they found the stairs now, the original stairs from the Herodian period that go back up toward the city of David where the temple was. Josephus clearly said that the city was so raised that you would never even know a city stood there. And we see it when we go in ancient Jerusalem. You see that everything was destroyed from that time period. In the New Testament, Yeshua said the same thing. He said not one stone would be upon another. And there, in what they're calling the Temple Mount, the Hiram, you have 10,000 Herodian stones. 10,000. So not only do you have 10,000 stones that aren't supposed to be there, but if that's the temple and not the Fort Antonia, the stones should not be Herodian stones at the base, they should be Solomonic stones. So that fact alone, that there's no Solomonic stones, but they did find the Solomonic stones in the city of David, and they did find the tower that Nehemiah built. They found it there. They have the archaeological evidence of the oil lamps and the pottery from the Persian era from that time. Clearly shows that the temple had to be in the city of David and not in the Hiram.
Antonia, which we believe is the Harem Sharif, or the Harem Sharif was the remnants of Fort Antonia, encompasses an area of 36 acres. And basically, it is the size of a typical Roman fortress, according to schematics and even remnants of other permanent Roman fortresses all over Europe, in Germany, and other places.
But when you realize that where we're standing here in the city of David was really where the temple was, and just to the north of me, where the harem is, was actually the Fort Antonia, Josephus told us that the ridge we're standing on, which would have been the northern tower of the temple, was exactly 600 feet from valley to valley. Here we are standing here. This area we're standing here from valley to valley is exactly 600 feet. You had to have probably 10 to 15,000 people. And whenever you look at a model of Jerusalem, like you saw in Jerusalem by Yonah, they always make Fort Antonia this tiny little fort that couldn't probably hold 100 people.
The model that we have at the Israeli Museum, poor piece of historical reflection. I believe that the Roman fort there is ridiculous. It's just this little appendage.
Because nothing suits that description that Josephus gives us. He says it was larger than the temple. He says it was more massive, bulky, the greater fortifications than the temple. It obscured the temple from the north vantage point if you would approach Jerusalem from the north. And everything fits. Fortress Antonia being that structure of the Haram Sharif. Nothing else fits.